It's worth pointing out before we start this that Tom Suken hat here, privately educated, ex-military, probably one of the poshest people in the House of Commons. This guy just went straight from being a parliamentary consultant to working in a think tank. Parliamentary consultant into think tank. That is all he's done. Zero real contribution to society. Anyway, let's have a listen to the couple of clips that I wanted to listen to from this.
Do you think you say it's old versus young, but is there also an element of this which is landlord versus renter, or landlord versus person who cannot
who owns the
buy?
land?
Who owns the land?
Who's the landlord? Sorry.
What do you mean, who's the landlord?
Well, older people.
I see what you mean. Because what I was watching, sorry, I thought you meant I was off my hypothetical.
I mean, it doesn't really matter who the person is who's the landlord, right? Tom's inference there is, well, there's no actual problem with the landlord-renter relationship in society per se. The problem is that the older people are the landlords. So he at least recognises that it is rent extraction, that it is value that is going from the poor to the rich, you know? But if it was just equitably distributed, the number of landlords throughout the generations, then he wouldn't have a problem with it. Well, it's a bad relationship, the fact that the people who are doing the extraction in the vast majority of cases tend to be older, but it is that wealth extraction that is the problem. It is that rentier capitalism that is the problem here. It is why you recognise it as being unfair that all the landlords are boomers and all the young people are the tenants, right? So you recognise the parasitic nature of this relationship. Maybe that means that we shouldn't have any landlords. Because she's right. It is a tenant-landlord problem.
Statistical landlord.
No.
I don't know. Who's my landlord? I'm also, I don't know. I pay an agency. I've got no idea who my landlord is.
You live where you want to live.
But I was watching Robert Jenrick's video that he put out today. I think it was today or yesterday, and he was talking about house building.
Okay.
And he's talking about immigration, and that being one of the main factors in why younger people can't get onto the housing ladder.
His videos are very good, by the way.
His videos are very slick.
Yeah.
But he was walking around NW1, which is actually not far from where we're sitting right now. And he was saying that mass unskilled migration is the reason that native Britons are now paying an extra £2,500 a year in rent.
Well, the number of houses per person in this country is at record highs. So actually, the supply of housing has continually exceeded, in terms of the increasing number of people, even with the quote-unquote mass migration. Now, it's worth pointing out that we have changing ways in which we live. This is pointed out earlier in this interview by the Tories there, that we actually have changing patterns in how people live. There is a monetary policy problem here in terms of where we put new money into the economy. We have problems with planning laws. These are all problems, right? But to solely blame immigration, as Robert Jenrick is being called out for here, is nonsensical when, as I said before, we have more houses per person than we literally have ever had in this nation's history. There has never been a point in time before now where we've had more houses per capita. The problem, of course, is that so many of these are bought up by landlords, so many of these are bought up by private equity firms, so many of these are sitting as part of a portfolio, so many of them are second houses, some of them being used as oligarch stores of value by Emirati billionaires, right? Using it as a store of petrodollars. These are all of the problems here. We have taken a commodity which is useful for its use of value, which is that you live in it, and we have used it as a store of value and treated it as a store of value for far too long.
And I was looking at the area, and I went to go and hypothetically rent a flat in NW1, and the cheapest flat I could find was a bedsit that was $17.50 a month. And the shower was next to the bed. And I just wonder, what unskilled migrant would be, which I guess would be classified as a care worker, who would be able to afford that? I don't imagine that they're the ones who are taking those homes.
But I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, because say if you're talking about people at the bottom end of the income scale, they come in and take, it's a bit like hermit crab shells, they come and take something at the bottom of the market, and then that pushes somebody up, and it comes back to the fundamental thing of, if there are too few homes, people are competing, and that drives up prices. That's.
And again, he's right to say this. This is the supply and demand thing here. If people can't afford to live in a certain area, they'll move to where it's poorer, and then they will push the prices up there and gentrify it, right? That's the way in which the supply and demand curve will intersect at a different place when demand outstrips supply. But as I said, number of houses per capita higher than it's ever been. There must be another problem here, which, again, they've not really touched on it enough. Because, again, they firmly believe in the commodification of housing, and they can't really admit to it being a huge problem here. Now, once you have commodified it, you can still build enough, so this doesn't become a problem. You just have to have rules in place so that people can't buy too many of them. I'm against this because I think that broadly, when you get the asset bubbles that's been created due to necessary government spending, right? It was necessary to do quantitative easing to fix the problems with the financial crisis. It was necessary to engage in a bunch of expansionary policy to get us through the pandemic. But that's filtered into the hands of people who can buy up housing, and therefore they've pushed the prices up, right? So the best way of protecting this specific store of value, which is incredibly necessary. Like, you can't live without a house, right? All of this money going into the stock market, all this money going into financial instruments, it's not ideal, but it's better than it going into housing, because everyone needs housing, not everyone needs financial instruments. You know, people trading around with financial instruments to have as much money in their portfolio as possible is far less relevant to the lives of everyday people than if that money gets put into housing and then the price gets bid up. Which, of course, if it wasn't commodified, wouldn't be a problem. This one goes up until 2020 here, but it shows you the UK is at this point, which is, again, the highest on this curve. Again, this isn't the number of houses in total, this is per capita. As you can see, it continually went up and up and up. We then kind of stopped building in 2010s where it went down slightly. That's when the Tories were in power and we did austerity. And then it's slightly increased in the wake of the run-up to the pandemic. Now, one would assume that since this point, this kind of curve has gone down a little. We had to welcome in a lot of refugees because of the war in Ukraine, etc., etc. But we have also increased house building as well. This is, again, showing you that it's more than just a problem of supply and demand. Because you've got to remember, on top of the fact that we're at this point here in the curve where we've continued had an increasing number of houses per person, the start of the pandemic, which is when the house prices started rising and it got a real problem, was literally when we started doing the stimulus policy during the pandemic, right? And all that extra money in the economy has been put into asset markets like housing. I've got this one here that's showing you that when you look at London on its own, every single borough here, between 2015 and 2022, they've all seen increases. None of these boroughs of London have seen a decrease housing stock per person. I looked it up because you mentioned it before, but it's gone up, but only slightly. But I wonder how much is skewed by more single-person households. Well, that's the point, yeah. Like, we have a changing way of living now. We have a changing way in which we live, in where more people live on their own, fewer people are pair bonding earlier. One thing that is true about migration is a lot of them do move in single family units, so they actually tend to make the housing stock get used a lot more efficiently than the existing population. What's funny, right, is that this is the reason for the bedroom tax. The rationale for the bedroom tax was we need to ensure that we are using our social housing more efficiently, so we need to have everyone in a house that is more suitable for them. So we're going to tax people more money, or we're going to inflict more costs upon people who are living in houses with spare bedrooms so that we can reallocate where people live more efficiently per bedroom. But what's funny, of course, is that this only applied to social housing. What this doesn't apply to is older generations who live in massive houses that their family have moved out of, that they don't need anymore, and they don't downsize because they have a connection to that house, right? And I'm sure you shouldn't have to force people to move if they don't want to. But of course, that will push up house prices if we are being less efficient with where we put our population. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask older people to want to reorganize their lives to live in a house that is far more suitable for them. I don't think that's unreasonable, chat. And of course, none of this would be a problem if we didn't have a commodified housing market. None of this would be a problem if the price was being set because we were allocating people houses by need rather than by the market.
That's what it is. And I think the fundamental tension between our points is what's the cause? And I think a better way of looking at it is how do we fix this? And you can do the kind of supply side reform that we talk about, but even if you do that, we're short about 5 million homes. So if you're adding 1 million people a year, you're just never going to quite get that. You're never going to get your rent down to a more manageable level.
It's worth pointing out when they say we've added 1 million people per year, that isn't true. We added 906,000 in 1 year because of a correlation of factors, including a lag on student visas because of the pandemic. This was during the war in Ukraine and, of course, refugees from Hong Kong. So the idea that, well, there's millions of immigrants coming in, that's not true. That just isn't true. Again, you can say that it's too high, and you're probably right. You're probably right that it's too high, and that we should be trying to ensure that we don't overburden our infrastructure. Because again, we've not invested in much infrastructure either. Housing is only one kind of part of this discussion. Because for every new person, that means more demand on hospitals and schools and police stations and fire stations, Like, we do need to build this extra infrastructure as well, which comes with loads of other costs and other externalities and having to go through planning reforms and planning laws. Like, all of these things are necessary to increase, should we increase the population overall, which we haven't done. But this idea that we're adding 1 million migrants per year, just 100% untrue. I'm not just using 1 year's number as a baseline there, Stu. We are using the literal highest year of migration ever as a baseline, which is very disingenuous.
So I think it's the trade-off on immigration has gone a little bit too far in recent years, far too far. But that's not it. And I think people need to articulate both of those things rather than saying immigration is my pet issue or housing is my pet issue. And in fairness to Rob, I think he would do both. So he brought forward, here's a good sort of, turning doors moment. He brought forward planning reforms that were quite ambitious and quite reasonable. What do you think would have led to a Conservative victory, or more likely Conservative victory, having higher growth and people being able to get on the housing ladder and having done all of those things, or what we did do, which was just duck the issue, right? It did not work for those MPs. Those MPs lost their seats. So it's doing both of those things and having the confidence to do those things.
The idea that somehow slightly higher growth would have led to the Conservatives winning the election is ultra super mega cope. It is nuclear levels of cope. I'm sorry, you just were desperate to want to slash the state, and poor people were relying on the state. Extra growth that almost certainly would have been subsumed by the most rich people in society would have benefited literally nobody because you had no desire to change any of the distribution. Like, Tories just live in an alternate reality. I'm a political consultant, I'm a think tanker. What's that? Distribution? Why should that matter? Just grow the economy, stupid.
My challenge would come from sort of demographic realities, right? We have an aging population. The pension bill is getting bigger. The tax base is getting smaller. And if younger people who are going to be economically productive and work in the country aren't coming here, how do you address that? And then secondly, and also, by the way, I think on this second point, you can make a left-wing argument, right? Which is like, okay, we're not importing care workers from, if you look at recent figures, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, South and Southeast Asia, take your pick. And as a result of that, you can make the argument then, okay, so hopefully we will see wage growth because we're not suppressing wages by bringing these people in. And, there's a left-wing argument to be made there. Right. It's not necessarily one that I might make, but you can make it for sure.
The Democratic Party made that in the States for years. That was their argument against the open border in Mexico, right up until, I'm going to get it wrong, but about 10, 15 years ago, was that what you were doing effectively was the evil capitalists importing cheap labor in order to keep down the cost of the working American.
Well, the problem, of course, is that if you have generalized migration, this is something that keeps being brought up as this idea that immigration as a concept just decreases wages. This isn't true. Not only do studies show that this isn't true, but basic economic sense shows you that this isn't true. So we both have empirical evidence and we have theoretical underpinning for this, which is that when you have more people, you have more demand as well as more supply. Like, people say, oh, well, you're increasing the labour supply. And I'm just like, yeah, well, what determines the number of jobs? Well, it's the size of the economy, isn't it? It is the level of demand in the economy that determines the number of jobs that there are. If you have more people working in your country earning wages, that's more people spending wages as well. And the places that they spend it, the extra demand that they create, will have to have other people working in jobs to be able to serve that demand. So this idea that it only influences supply and also not demand in the economy is just nonsensical, right? What does happen is you get wage distortions. You distort your labour market by bringing in certain people. So, for example, if you open up specifically a bunch of visas for care workers or truck drivers, right? Two professions that we generally have had a labour shortage of, care workers and truck drivers, and you just give visas for these specific roles, then the bargaining power of these sectors of the economy goes down because the supply is specific. The supply of this specific sector of the economy is going up, demand is going up across the economy more broadly. So that's where you do get labour market distortions. It's why certain sectors of society were more prone to voting for Brexit than others, because they were affected by the wage arbitrage of the European Union single market, for example. But of course, people coming into the economy just as generalised migration, they're working in all kinds of sectors. They're working in food service, they're working in delivery, they're working in retail, they're working in skilled professions, they're working as doctors, nurses, care workers, they're working as teachers, they're working as IT service people, they're working as whatever, right? It's all across the economy. So what it doesn't do is make a distortion unless it's a very specific kind of migration.
There's an element of truth in that here too. Of course there is, right? I mean, it applies in everything. The more people there are.
And this is why the left is...
See? You know why he said, well, the more people there are, He didn't want to follow that statement down because he knows it's untrue. Like, he just knows that it's not true. He knows that both supply and demand are necessary to understand when you look at wage setting. Again, if you really want to protect workers, and this has been my point from the start when it comes to migration, put everyone in a trade union. Have an entire economy where wages aren't set by labour markets. Wages are set by collective bargaining agreements between consortia of workers and consortia of employers.
Losing the working class to some extent, because those traditional jobs that used to be better paying are now not worth it. And actually, on welfare, you can get similar levels of income.
So these are two lies. These are two lies here. First of all, to do the most recent one, you can't get as much as you can on benefits as you can working unless you are disabled. Or maybe unless you have 20 children or something. But then again, child benefit is capped now because of the two-child benefit cap anyway. Or the two-child cap on universal credit. That's what it really is, not the two-child benefit cap. But the only way you ever actually really earn more on welfare, or you make more money on welfare, is if you're disabled. The second point that I'll respond to is the first thing he said there, which is that those jobs that used to be high-paying aren't high-paying anymore because of immigration. That's just not true. These jobs don't pay as much anymore because they're not unionised anymore. Union density is lower than it's ever been. The number of people who belong to a trade union in this country is lower than nominal terms than what it was in 1980. So not only do we have a smaller percentage, we have fewer people even though the population is higher. And that's the thing, is people try, as I've said before many, many, many times, to imply that the manufacturing jobs, the jobs of yesteryear, were the good jobs. And the reason why the wages suck is because we transitioned to a service economy post-1980. That's not true. The reason why our wages suck is because we're not in trade unions. People in service sector jobs in Scandinavian countries have much higher purchasing power, despite their smaller economies, than we do in the UK in our current manufacturing jobs. It is the lack of trade union representation. Dean Baker has done lots and lots and lots of good work on this, as has Matt Brunig. I highly recommend you checking out specifically Dean Baker's work. It's the Centre for Economic Policy Research. It's got loads of articles on trade union membership being important in driving higher wages. But then again, these people hate trade unions because they believe that they're rentiers. It's taking the hard-earned money away from the capitalists and the shareholders. Wow. Will someone please think of the shareholders?
We have a very high number of people, Indigenous Brits, who aren't working. So it's not as if we don't have the people who could do those jobs. It's the wages are so low, a lot of people aren't working. It's not.
The wages are low, are they? The wages are low. I wonder if supply-side labour market reform constantly for the last 46 years might have anything to do with that, chat. I wonder if the wages might be shit because not only was growth bad under these people, but also the distribution of income towards capital has increased as a ratio with regards to the income being given to labour in the economy. That's your doing. He has donned the hot dog suit. And even then, he says, well, a lot of British people not working. The labour force participation rate isn't that much different to what it used to be. Let me bring up the statistics. This is the labour force participation rate for the UK. Like in 2025, it is currently 78%. So, I mean, it reached its record high just before the pandemic. We had a big drop off then. But it's not like that much lower than what the peak was. It's broadly higher in terms of labour force participation than it was throughout the entirety of the 2000s. Only by a couple of percentage points, mind. But this idea that we somehow have this huge kind of glut of people who aren't working, that we've just got this scroungers versus skivers thing going on, when in reality our labour force participation rate is still pretty high. I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all. Again, they're just trying to find ways of talking about this as if the lack of trade union representation isn't a problem, when of course it absolutely is.
That's a simplified argument, but I think there is a solution that isn't mass immigration.
But, I mean, Blair was sort of, I guess, the precursor to what we're experiencing with this now. I mean, and particularly in the construction industry, this was like, a huge issue throughout the Blair years. Not to do a history lesson, because I know you don't want to do one, but why... If that was identified and if that was seen as, these wages are going to be driven down if you, quote unquote, import labour, why was that not the first thing that was changed under the Conservative government?
Because neither of these like trade unions. The singular way that you would protect these people's wages is if these construction industries had a sectoral bargaining agreement that set a wage floor. Simple as that. Then you can increase the labour supply as much as you want in that specific sector, and the wages would be set by the wage floor because of the collective bargaining agreement. You couldn't be undercut by having specific visas to fill these particular labour gaps.
Why did you not halt those, people being brought in to work in these fields?
It's a fair challenge, and I'm not, I share my own part of the blame in this story too. I mean, as you know, I spent most of the recent few years in politics focusing on foreign affairs, security and defence. But should I have been more vocal on this sort of issue? Yeah, I probably should. I mean, I think that's a fair criticism. You're right. I can explain it to you. I can't sort of excuse it. I can give you the explanation, but not. But it doesn't make it right. These are difficult fights to have.
And again, because they don't want to talk about the real answer here. And this is the problem I have with politics, Joe. They don't mention trade unions in this discussion. They don't mention the single thing that would deal with a lot of these problems, which I know they care about. I know that they're big fans of trade unions. And they would want to put this to Conservatives, whose opposition to trade unions is essentially just a Hayekian argument about markets deciding all value rather than social utility or collective bargaining deciding value. That's it. That's their only understanding of why they don't like trade unions. It's this theoretical basis for what looks like a market clearing. It's what I say every time when you speak to neoliberals, you speak to right-wing people in terms of their economic arguments. All they care about is the heuristic of does the market clear or not. Like if you have a cleared market, that means the labour is lower than the value it could otherwise have, So if you increase the value of that labour, the market would not clear. The market would not clear, but the people who are doing the work would get a better remuneration and it would be a better and fairer society.
Kent County Council, for example, about the cost of social care, and you're trying to constrain the cost of local government, and the social care folk say to you, well, in that case, I need this amount of cheap labour. That's the deal. What James is talking about, you're changing the nature of demographics. In fact, when you looked at European demographics, it was pretty much, I mean, not exactly, but it was sort of one job, one migrant sort of thing. And in the last few years, it's 1 to 4, 1 to 5, I think it is. It's something like that. Because people...
And again, like, the additional people working will create more jobs. If you want to take one thing away from this video, if you take one thing at all away from this video, the number of jobs is not fixed. There is no fixed number of jobs. This is entirely dependent on the state of the economy. If you have more people spending more money in your economy, that will create the demand for jobs.
coming with their dependents because they're coming on a visa, it's temporary, they're coming to.
But also, you could make an argument that perhaps you yourself are responsible for a large influx of immigration because of the Ukraine scheme and also the Hong Kong scheme, with your focus on foreign affairs during that time. But do you think that there's a morality point that sort of supersedes then the?
So I think there's two bits about migration, and I think it's worth sort of looking at what it is you're doing. I think when the British people, first of all, I think are extremely reasonable on this. So the opposition to Hong Kong or Ukraine has been, zero as far as I can tell. There might have been some, but
What's that, Tom? What's that? You're saying that there was very little pushback to refugees from Ukraine or Hong Kong? Then it's super weird, isn't it? It's super weird that there was no pushback to these people, yet there was loads of pushback to people arriving from Afghanistan or from Iran or Sudan. It's a bit weird, isn't it? It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting, isn't it? When I worked in my trade and the minimum wage was introduced, my wages did not increase. Instead, my apprenticeship was ignored and I was expected to work for minimum wage, which is why it is better to have a Nordic wage setting system of trade union collective sectoral bargaining agreements with no minimum wage than a neoliberal economy with a minimum wage but without collective bargaining agreements. The relative income of labour to capital is much better in Scandinavian countries than it is in the UK.
But as far as I can tell, there's been almost no opposition to either of those, because actually people understand. Look, this is, you're losing your liberty to communist tyranny, or you're literally being murdered by Russian violence. Right?
Yeah, really weird. Then it's really weird. Then, Tom, that they don't have the same understanding for people being killed by the Taliban or by the Ayatollah or by mercenaries hired by the United Arab Emirates. It's weird we don't mention that ever, given that we have a positive international geopolitical relationship with the United Arab Emirates. And we had a hand in destabilising Iran and Afghanistan. Weird that these things don't come up often in the discourse. We hear loads about how the Ukrainians, the Hong Kongers just have to come here because of the actions of evil China and obviously genuinely evil Russia. But when it comes to people who are being attacked by our allies or who are destabilised by us, suddenly we've got to raise the drawbridge. Don't you find that strange, Tom? Don't you find that a bit weird? A Big Mac in Denmark is slightly higher, Waluigi Mangione, but the purchasing power parity is higher. So there is a specific metric for people who don't know in chat called purchasing power parity, which looks at the cost of currency, the cost of the commodity, and you look at the level of wages, and you compare it to create what is actually, ironically, known as the Big Mac Index in some places, which is how much is a Big Mac in dollars relative to wages. So you look at the Big Mac Index, who has the highest purchasing power as a working class person? It's everyone in the Scandinavian countries. It's everyone in the Nordic countries. All of them, bar none, have the highest purchasing power parity, and they have lower growth than other countries, right? Everyone talks about the high growth in the United States and the global south, in China, Taiwan, Thailand, Singapore, whatever it is. And yet, despite this high level of growth, not enough of it trickles down to the workers that the lower growth countries in Scandinavia still have higher standards of living because they have higher purchasing power parity for regular working class people.
The fact that you want to come to the UK, perfectly reasonable. For Ukrainians, it's temporary. For Hong Kong as well, they are British nationals. So it's merely recognising a fact that they're British nationals under a slightly different nationality order, but they are British nationals. That's not the same as seeing large numbers of migrants coming for employment reasons or for...
Weird. It's weird how it's like, well, they're just migrants. When it's Ukrainians and Hong Kongers, it's people fleeing tyranny. When it's everybody else, when it's the Browns chat, or it's just migrants coming over, just migrants. That's weird framing, isn't it, Tom? Then again, that might have to face up to the fact that this motherfucker was one of the people who helped destabilise the nations that the other refugees are fleeing from.
Or indeed on small boats, which is the most egregious. But you know what I mean?
Is it egregious? Is it egregious, or is it the difference between the regular managed route that we have for Ukrainians and Hong Kongers and the fact that no such regular route has been set up to people fleeing from Eritrea or from Iraq?
And so people do understand it differently. And it is certainly true that those numbers count in the housing figure, if you see what I mean. But it's also true that I think British people understand that there is a difference between somebody who's facing immediate and violent persecution by Russians and somebody who's coming for employment opportunity.
This motherfucker trying to imply that people fleeing the Taliban or people fleeing militias paid by our ally, the United Arab Emirates, are somehow economic migrants travelling on small boats and not the legitimate asylum seekers in 75% of cases that they actually are. This motherfucker, this disingenuous, lying motherfucker.
Is Kemi Bain not being honest with people right now?
I think she's getting there, actually.
Yeah.
Talking about, Javier Milei, that is the start of saying we are spending too much as a society. That means we can't invest and we can't cut taxes and we're in a doom loop. She's getting there. She's been talking.
So you're talking about the lack of investment in this country because we're spending too much. You spent 14 years in government, 9 years of which interest rates were quite literally zero, and you did no capital investment. In fact, you cut capital investment budgets, part of your austerity plan, deliberately so that you could shovel money into the increasing OPEX on things that were necessary to clean up the mess that the lack of CapEx had created. To try and say that our lack of investment is because we're spending too much rather than too little is fucking insane. It is genuinely demented stuff here. Also a very good point by Ben saying, what about cutting the state pension? To be fair to these guys, given that they have spent a lot of this interview talking about intergenerational unfairness, I think they probably do believe the triple lock wants to go. This guy certainly mentions gutting the triple lock as well, and I think his argument was not unreasonable. But saying that our lack of investment that creates jobs is down to too much spending rather than too little spending is so insane. It is so genuinely insane when we talk about, for example, too many people going to university. They're going to bring this up later, so it's some foreshadowing here, chat. That, there are not enough graduate jobs to go into, so we're oversupplying people with university degrees. No. The reason why we have too many people with university degrees is because these motherfuckers destroyed the economy with austerity. So our graduate premium was reduced, whilst in America, where their graduate premium has stayed the same or increased, and there are graduate jobs for young people, they looked at the fallout from the financial crisis and decided that austerity was stupid. That austerity was a dumb idea and there was no point in doing it, so they just kept putting money into the economy. And that meant that they kept their graduate premium and Europe didn't, because all of Europe decided to do austerity because we're stupid. Because we took Reinhard Rogoff seriously. As has been pointed out in chat, the UK suffers from low level of both private and public sector investment. I would argue that the lack of private sector investment, again, which we were told would increase to replace the public sector investment that was cut, because, quote unquote, the public sector was crowding out the private sector. Totally untrue. That never happened under Blair, never happened in the post-war period. That's just a total economic lie. That's some Friedmanite nonsense neoliberal bullshit, this idea that public spending crowds out private sector spending. That's just nonsense. When in reality, it's the lack of public spending that has been the source of lack of private investment, because you can't guarantee that you'll get a return on investment as a private sector investor if there aren't healthy people to do the work, because people are stuck on NHS waiting lists, and there's also a problem in terms of the actual social infrastructure doesn't exist to be able to facilitate everything else. Like, we've not invested in things such as power generation. For the energy costs for industrial sector in this country are higher than basically everywhere else in Europe. We've not done investment in transport to be able to get people to potential locations where private investment might happen. There are a myriad reasons why the public sector not investing has caused a dearth of private sector investment. In fact, as Mariana Mazzucato points out, public sector investment is a way of crowding in private sector investment by understanding that the social infrastructure that's necessary for private sector investors to turn a profit is available, which of course hasn't happened at all since we started austerity in 2010. So for them to look at Javier Milei as a economic fucking oracle is insane. The guy who's literally gone cap in hand to the IMF.
Talking about housing recently, she's getting there on how we do that and the density. So those arguments are starting to happen. They just need to be really hammered for 5 years so that people trust us by the time we we get to government.
The reason I ask is obviously she's the leader of the party.
Yeah.
Bobby J, Robert Jenrick, whatever you want to call him, he's making those arguments publicly. He has been along the lines of the stuff we've been talking about, right? And I mean, he's kind of your parliamentary champion, shall we say, for NGT. Would that be a fair way to describe him?
We've always been associated with like we have lots of thing, but it's always like, oh, you're when we first started it was, are you a Trussite party or a Sunakite party? And it's like, no, we just care about a handful of issues and the direction of the country. Yeah. And people were just like blown by that being, which in itself speaks to the problem that we're not about leadership vehicle. But yeah, Rob gets it, but Kemi gets it as well. And I think bringing the whole party along on that journey, so you've got that kind of group of 2,000 people in the broadest sense who actually really want to be like, right, as a party, we're going to deliver that change. Because it's not just about the leader. Because if you get in as leader and you haven't laid the turf, your party just throws you out. It's the same thing's happening with Starmer. He's looking really wobbly at the moment because he's not got the credibility. He's not laid the arguments. So people just get a new leader.
I mean, he's not wrong about the lack of argument, but then again, they also have a lack of policy, so that's two problems there. And of course, Kemi doesn't have policy either. The problem, of course, is her policies are literally just, we are going to do the same shit that Cameron and Osborne did. We're going to do it even more. You hated it last time, but I promise you'll like it this time. As if that's going to win over young people? Again, you only get to this position if you live in a world of fucking neoliberal groupthink as these people do. You go, look at that country with 33% poverty rate. Let's do what they're doing. And I'm just like, you're not winning anybody. You're not winning young people, which is literally what they're trying to do here. Again, this motherfucker, has not had a real job in his life, right? This posh boy who went to private school. This Oxbridge-educated bellend here who went to the military has done far more contribution to society than this little fucking fetus has in his life, Mr. Political Consultant to think tanker. And he's going, well, I know exactly what's going to win over young people. You genuinely do not know what is going to win over young people. Because you've never met any in your life that haven't lived in a tiny posh boy bubble. I'm interested to see how much of the 16, 17-year-olds would actually vote Tory. More in common, and I think JL Partners did some polls on this, Party Popper, and it was like 5%. The Tories were in 5th place in the 16 to 17s. In some, they were in the last general election, Party Popper, sorry, Midnight Stand, sorry, I'm talking about. Oh, sorry, Party Popper, I got the coming confused. Midnight Stand asked this question. But Midnight Stand, at the last general election, the under 35s, the Tories were in 5th place. So not just the young people, just working age millennials, the Tories were in 5th behind Labour, Lib Dems, Reform, Greens. Like, if just working age people voted and there were no retirees, the Tories would have been wiped out of the last election.
Even after his purge of the Labour Party, where he did have, he's got a number of Labour MPs that do vote with the whip. And well, I think they definitely will actually when Parliament returns this September after they've seen what happens when you don't.
I don't know about you. Yeah, but I don't know. Does that communicate power? Does that communicate authority?
Well, actually, that'd probably be a better question for Tom. If you start expelling your MPs, does it communicate?
I don't think. If there's a very specific thing you're trying to do, and it's a very clear, you were elected on this manifesto pledge, you promised to do this, you haven't, then yes. I'm not quite sure what they were expelled for. Right, and I follow politics pretty closely.
Yeah.
And I'm not.
You could say
it's not.
I'm not quite sure because it seems to be a range of issues. And what was it? What was the expression that they were? Somebody in number 10 came up with the expression that they were just being expelled for just being regular.
Knobheads.
Not headery. That's right. That was
Knob headery. Yeah.
And it was like
doesn't quite count.
It's not. No. What have you? Those are really odd grounds.
Well, they did all have in common. They'd all been on PoliticsJoe in the months coming up to that. I was like,
do you think I'm going to lose the level?
You are at risk, Tom.
I guess, this is a bit informal now, but I actually guessed the fourth one off the back of, there's only one other one that has recently been on in the last 4 weeks. Is it that one? And when I rang up someone to ask, they said yes.
They were
solid stuff.
That's good.
Yeah, media kingmakers on PoliticsJoe. Absolutely.
Do you think there needs to be a bit of a shuffling of the I don't know, moving around what's going with the current members of the Conservative Party?
No, I think there's sorry, I'm really not interested in the reshuffling and the whatever. Look, we've got 4 years or 3 years. we've had this musical chairs game for the last, whatever it is, 6 or 8 years. I mean, come on, grow up.
And to the point of credibility.
Yeah, it's
absolutely, yeah.
just get over it.
Again, these people are just playing on their phones in the dinghy at the edge of Niagara Falls. Look at them. Like, just like, no, it's fine. We need to reshuffle. We don't need to change strategy. Just go with more neoliberalism and everything's going to be fine. And I'm just like, you're going to get fucking annihilated. You're going to get wiped out. Look at the current shadow cabinet. And obviously, I don't think that the shadow cabinet is going to be the be-all and end-all of Tory electoral success. Far from it. It's their lack of policy that isn't genuine insanity that is the problem, you know? But just on the basis of credibility of the shadow cabinet, it's just full of morons. It's just full of complete non-entities. People who would just not win over anybody, let alone young people. A bunch of private school posh boys, never actually contributed to society. Now, the Alex Burkharts of this world, just shrill RP accents that nobody is going to win over by them, and they're just going, that's fine. We'll just get some normal policies. We'll get some credibility in the public eye. Kemi will do her job well. We'll talk about Have Emile some more, and come the next election, reform. They'll see through the populism of reform, and they'll come back to the sensible Tories again. And this is fantasy shit. This is absolute fantasy shit. Honestly, I'm so glad that the people in the Tory party are just completely out of touch dullards, because it's going to be so much fun watching them get humiliated at the next election. It's going to be so satisfying. I understand that means a reform government, which is going to be shit, but I'm going to at least enjoy the absolute collapse of the Conservative Party.
Kemi's leading. Kemi's setting out the right questions at the moment. She's beginning to get on for points that we're talking about. You're right, Rob's doing a good job. By the way, others are doing a good job too. And it's and in fact some new intake people like Katie Lamb and Harriet Cross and Nick Timothy are doing some good work as well. So it's not, it's not about.
That's the same Nick Timothy that ran the Theresa May election campaign in 2017. Just to point that out.
One intake or another intake is not about who's the leader and who's the whatever. The team's working, right? But there are some areas where we really do need to challenge some of the thinking, and that's one of the things I'm going to be doing over the coming months and years, because we have really run out of road. I mean, James hinted at this, but it is not impossible that Rachel Reeves' budget in whenever it is October, got to assume it's in October. She finds that she can't do any of the 3 things the government's supposed to be able to do. She can either cut, I mean, we just found that out at the welfare vote, whenever it was a few weeks ago. She can't borrow because the markets won't lend, and that taxes actually deliver less income, as the recent capital gains tax.
Well, he's lying about the capital gains tax stuff. It didn't go down in anything due to capital flight or people rearranging their circumstances to avoid the increase in capital gains. It was just a change in the cycle of investment. We have not had a full year since the capital gains tax was changed last October. Once we've had the full year and the full investment cycle, we'll know the numbers. The numbers at the moment have not been shown that the numbers at the moment do not show that we are to the right of the Laffer curve that he is claiming. Of course, we could raise income tax. They've ruled it out, and we should raise income tax, and we should also have a wealth tax, and we should increase capital gains tax. We should raise taxation here. We are not at the top of the Laffer curve like he is implying here. Again, openly, he knows that we're not at the top of the Laffer curve, because it's like 70%, 60-70% usually. So he knows that this is true. He's just not trying to make the argument that tax rises are something that is possible for the government. And on top of this, markets don't have to lend. We do have a central bank. But even so, we are a stable economy. There is no reason why markets won't lend to Rachel Reeves. The reason why she won't borrow is because she's reached her fiscal rules. Like, the fiscal headroom is set by the fiscal rules. If she ditched the fiscal rules, they would be able to, by their own metrics, borrow more money. But the idea that there aren't bond buyers out there in the auctions is just not true. He's just lying.
Report demonstrated. So, it is entirely possible that at her next budget, we end up getting a phone call from the IMF saying, guys, you've run out of money.
Well, no, we won't. because we're a sovereign currency issuer, so there's no reason why we'd go to the IMF. It's just untrue. The reason why Milei is going to the IMF right now is because he's trying to dollarize the Argentine economy. We don't have a particularly large amount of bonds held overseas. It's mostly internal to the UK economy, and we are a sovereign currency issuer. There is no chance of us running out of money.
This doesn't work. Now, if we're not willing to take some of these choices, if we're not willing to take on some of these sacred cows, then frankly, they're going to be full stops as they were in the 70s. I'm glad to say we're all too young to remember that happening, even me. But it is absolutely true that, you know, we are now out of road, and we really do have to start thinking hard about what to change.
Triple locks are saying.
Again, we're just not out of road. It's just not true. Again, you can just increase taxes. The bond markets care about one thing, getting paid back, to capital expenditure, spending that has an ROI such as housing, and they won't care. Literally. All you have to do is tell the bond markets, this is what we're borrowing for, and this is how we'll guarantee you a return on that bond. And they will lend to the government. They will. Like, perfectly reasonable to do so.
Sacred cow, isn't it?
It is a sacred cow.
Break it.
It really needs to be looked at, doesn't it? It really needs to be looked at. Look, the pension is going to be costing 3 times the defence budget by 2050, right? Now, when David Cameron and George Osborne introduced the triple lock, it was supposed to get pensioners out of poverty and to develop. Nobody expected it to be costing this much, and nobody had the predictions then of where it was going to grow into in the welfare bill. It is now a very, very significant part of welfare. You're right, it's got to be looked at.
The problem with the triple lock and its origin was it fixed an increase in spending without an increase in growth. It's we're going to continue to increase this, quite quickly, regardless of how the economy performs. And that's the type of thinking that we need to break, because now it would be very difficult to change the triple lock, very politically difficult, because voters now expect it. They expect it in perpetuity. But there will be a point where the triple lock overtakes GDP spending. I mean, that would be ridiculously long time in the future. But we need to go back to saying to people, if you want spending on welfare, pensions, the health system, we need to grow the economy. That's we need to stop rinsing businesses. We need to be, pro startup and scale up and listing.
I mean, we literally are. That's what the National Wealth Fund policy is for. Again, it's not big enough. It doesn't have enough equity. We don't focus enough on cooperative businesses that at least put money into the hands of consumers so that we can maximize the Keynesian multiplier. We did this whole cut regulations for business stuff, cut taxes for business stuff, when these guys were in government. Did it lead to startups? No. All it led to was a funneling of wealth upwards. Rishi Sunak admitted this. He admitted that our low corporate tax regime was a total failure. Even Sunak did. I don't disagree with his analysis of the triple lock. I mentioned this earlier. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that unless we can grow the economy at the level to which they're increasing spending on the triple lock, it's going to be unaffordable, especially if we have a shrinking working age population to be able to facilitate that. So I'm ambivalent on cutting the triple lock. I can see the arguments, right? But this idea that we're somehow this incredibly hostile country for business is just an inversion of reality.
We need to really back aspiration, all of those things that get the economy growing. You need to fuel that fire. And I think...
And again, this idea that, quote unquote, backing aspiration is a method of economic growth is just fundamentally untrue. It goes back to what I say every single time. The key driver of economic growth is increasing total factor productivity, which is a function essentially of innovation. And the idea that innovation is the sole preserver of the private sector is a neoliberal lie. And not just a lie in terms of theoretics, but a lie in terms of empirics. Insofar as most of the biggest leaps that we've made in technological innovation have come from state investment, from universities, from academic centres, from DARPA, If the private sector was necessary for technological innovation, explain the Soviet Union. I'll make the clarification as I do every time I make this comparison. I don't support the Soviet Union. I don't think command economies are good. I don't support a lot of economic planning, especially not the entire economy being planned. But if private investment if entrepreneurialism was a necessary component of economic growth, then the Soviet Union would not have grown by 700%. Innovation is important. It can come from the private or public sector, but this narrative that the only way that you can facilitate this is by removing regulations on private investment is nonsense. Because what have we gotten in the world post-DARPA? What have we gotten in the neoliberal era? What innovation have we gotten that's increased total factor productivity to a large extent? Oh, great. We've replaced latitude and longitude with what 3 words? Brilliant. How innovative. Great. Thanks. I mean, I agree from the people in chat saying a Green New Deal, a Green Industrial Revolution, some kind of industrial strategy to maximize our geopolitical competitiveness in the green industries. And that could involve a lot of state investment, a lot of state investment into R&D, which I'm glad this government are increasing somewhat, but I think they could go further. That would be a really good way of maximizing our competitive advantage by feeding into public innovation, by backing our academics, which we're not doing. We have a university funding crisis in this country. We need to have academics there to be able to engage in the investment to make our country more productive. And we're cutting funding for universities. We're increasing tuition fees. We are trying to be restrictive on student visas.
As passionately as it should have done in the past, we've sort of forgotten about it. It's all about how much can we spend, and where do we spend?
Like, these people live in a different reality, chat. These people live in an inverse reality. Oh, well, the Tories for far too long, we've talked about how much we can spend or not how much we can cut. George Osborne was literally a Conservative Chancellor. For 9 years, all you did was cut. We had like 2 years of Boris Johnson actually engaging in some level of expansionary policy, partly due to necessity because of the pandemic, partly due to policy that they had planned beforehand because they wanted to increase NHS investment and build the hospitals, whatever, you know? To do the levelling up paradigm that they had in the 2019 manifesto. But for the vast majority of those 14 years, under Sunak and Truss, and then under Cameron and under Theresa May, outside of the Boris Johnson interregnum, it was all about austerity. It was how little we can spend, how many taxes we can cut.
As opposed to how do we actually get the economy growing? Rachel Reeves has paid lip service to it, but I don't think has really seriously gone down that path.
Well, especially when you think about student loans, is that something that you would ever campaign after? I mean, the graduate tax that is, I mean, extraordinary. You know, the interest that is applied to student loans. Is that something that you would ever consider revising?
I mean, again, you're raising a really important. I mean, it's become another sacred cow. You know, the idea that people should be paying 7-8% interest, as it was, even when it was.
Raise taxes. Just raise taxes. I'm sorry, I'm so sick of having to make this argument to people who think that we have a finite amount of public spending available when our overall level of tax take as a percentage of GDP, our overall expenditure as a share of GDP from the state is lower than most other Western European countries who have better welfare states and better social infrastructure than we do. Just raise taxes. And then we can make university free at the point of use like we did before. Or indeed, we could just have our loans not be incredibly debilitatingly expensive to pay back. And then what the Tories did was extend the period with which you have to pay it back as well on the grounds of, well, students don't vote for us. Well, good luck, Tories. You're facing electoral oblivion. Well done.
1% interest on housing. It's ridiculous. You know, you simply can't be running that. But the truth is, actually, you've got to look at a hell of a lot of other things as well. Because the truth is, you know, the £9,000 a year doesn't cover the cost of tuition. Okay, well, what does that mean for the university sector? What does it mean for the way that you do education in this country if you cannot afford to teach a student on an amount that is then repayable over a career?
You subsidise them with international students, yeah.
Well, that's effectively what we've done. But what is that?
Yeah, because we didn't fund them enough from central government, like all the other good European countries do.
That's sustainable, really, because that raises some other really serious questions as well. So this is the whole sort of area where you've got to look at these areas as a whole, and you've got to be pretty frank about it. Is it genuinely sustainable that you're going to have a multiple university systems in a single town?
I mean, I think it is. And again, this idea, well, we can't just rely on international students forever. I mean, we quite literally can. We quite literally can. Our university sector is one of our comparative advantages. We have some of the best universities in the world. We have some of the most established academics in the world. The history of Britain as a country, one of the things that should be a source of national pride, something that these nationalist right-wing types talk about constantly, this missing sense of national pride. One thing that should be a sense of national pride is everything that the UK as an academic centre has contributed to the world of science, into the world of the humanities, into the world of academia in general. We have been on the cutting edge of research forever, and we still are. We still are one of the best countries to be an academic at time of recording, even with everything that's happened in terms of cuts to universities. And the idea that we go, well, we don't want too many foreign students because that might increase the numbers going up for overall net migration figures, when it's the perfect world. People in this country get lower tuition because it's being subsidised by rich students from overseas, meaning we get foreign capital imported into the UK, which is good for growth. It's essentially an export good, something we have very little of with a big trade deficit. If you use foreign capital to pay for the academic product that we are giving to them, that we are selling to them, and it subsidises having cheaper deals for us, for our own students too. That is the best of both worlds. And they're here denigrating this system as if it's a bad thing.
No, but these are really expensive ways of conducting education. Are they the best way? And we've got ourselves into a whole series of pattern of spending for a whole series of reasons. Partly is Tony Blair's 50% of the population should go to university. Partly is we haven't, or rather we've massively slashed, and then only in the last 10 years started to pick up on apprenticeships. Partly it's because of the way that we've done student loans and and graduate tax effectively. But it now means that if you're a 30-something-year-old living in London, I don't mean central London like here, but like an hour out Ealing sort of way.
Yep.
You could easily be commuting an hour each way, spending several grand on your travel card, living in a shoebox, and coming back at the end of the month with pennies in your pocket. I mean, it's
almost an argument for not doing the austerity that you did, which kneecapped growth in this country, and again, also killed the graduate premium. It's an argument for not doing these things, Tom. You say, well, graduates don't earn enough in this country anymore. I mean, you were in control of the economy for all of this period. Your party was the one who had the economic policy choices that led to a reduction in expenditure on private investment and public sector investment that could have created those good graduate jobs. And here we are, where graduates are pissed off and they're turning to the left because of all the things you did in government. And you're like, yeah, well, we just need to tell people not to go to university anymore. And that's not the problem here. US graduate premium, as I mentioned before, US graduate premium continually increasing. There's a really great article by John Byrne Murdoch in the Financial Times. It's from last year, I think, or might have been the year before, which talks about the difference in the graduate premium between the US and the UK. And just to cover my arse on this one as well, JBM makes the explicit point too, that the difference between the US and the UK isn't that they have better graduates than we do, for example, insofar as the percentage of these graduates that are STEM graduates, for example, like the most economically viable degrees, very, very similar. Because the first argument you get in response is, well, actually the graduate premium is dropping because everyone's getting Mickey Mouse degrees, and that's just not the case. At least not in greater numbers than they are in the United States. And yet again, their graduate premium is going up because they didn't do austerity, and our graduate premium has collapsed because we did. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.